The wind howled like a grieving mother, slicing through Ethan Carter's thin jacket as he stood trembling on the icy slope. At 18, he was alone, abandoned in the Colorado Rockies, his breath clouding in the freezing dusk. His stepmother's final words echoed, "You're no son of mine." Ethan's knees buckled, not from the cold, but from the weight of betrayal. Margaret, the woman who'd raised him since he was 6, had driven him to this desolate ridge under the pretense of a camping trip. She'd discovered his secret, his love for a boy named Caleb from school, and her disgust had led to this. A backpack with a single bottle of water, a granola bar, and no way back. He sank into the snow, his heart pounding with fear and fury. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, their peaks sharp and unforgiving under the fading light. Ethan had always been the quiet kid, the one who sketched wildflowers in his notebook and dreamed of a life beyond the small, judgmental town of Silver Pines. But now, survival was his only dream. He forced himself to stand, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, and checked his backpack again. The granola bar was already half crushed, the water bottle too small to last a day. His phone, dead. Margaret had made sure of that. Silver Pines was a speck in the valley below, its lights twinkling like stars mocking his isolation. Ethan's father, Tom, had died 4 years ago, leaving him with Margaret, who'd never hidden her resentment. She'd tolerated Ethan, but his coming out had shattered her fragile facade of family. "You're an abomination," she'd hissed before driving away, her red SUV disappearing into the twilight. Ethan wiped his tears, his fingers numb, and vowed to survive, not for her, but for himself. The first night was a battle against the cold. Ethan found a shallow cave, its walls glistening with frost, and curled up inside, wrapping his jacket tighter. His mind raced with memories of Caleb's shy smile, the way their hands had brushed during study hall, the stolen kiss behind the bleachers. Caleb had been his first taste of hope, but now that hope felt like a cruel joke. Ethan's teeth chattered as he whispered to himself, "I'm not nothing. I'm not." The words became his mantra, a shield against despair. By morning, his body ached, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. He rationed the granola bar, nibbling tiny bites, and sipped the water sparingly. The mountains were vast, but Ethan remembered fragments of survival tips from his dad's old hiking books. Follow water downhill. Look for animal trails. Stay visible. He stumbled through the snow, his sneakers soaked, searching for a stream or a path. Every step was a rebellion against Margaret's abandonment, a refusal to let her win. Hours blurred into days. Ethan's hands blistered from gripping branches, his face burned from the wind. On the third day, he found a frozen creek and followed it, his legs shaking from exhaustion. He didn't know if he was heading toward salvation or deeper into the wilderness, but stopping wasn't an option. He thought of Caleb, of the life he wanted, a life where he could love freely, where he wasn't defined by someone else's hate. On the 5th day, a miracle, a ranger's cabin, its chimney puffing smoke. Ethan collapsed at the door, too weak to knock. When he woke, he was wrapped in blankets, a grizzled ranger named Hank peering down at him. "Kid, you're lucky to be alive," Hank said, his voice gruff but kind. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was raw. Hank fed him soup, radioed for help, and soon, Ethan was airlifted to a hospital in Denver. The hospital was a blur of IVs and questions. Social services got involved, and Ethan learned Margaret had claimed he'd run away. Her lies stung worse than the frostbite on his fingers. He was placed in foster care, far from Silver Pines, and though his body healed, his heart carried the scars of her betrayal. Yet, in that hospital bed, Ethan made a promise. He'd build a life worth living, one where love would outweigh hate. Months turned into years. Ethan, now 20, enrolled in community college in Boulder, studying art. He found a chosen family in his foster siblings and a mentor in his art teacher, Ms. Rivera, who saw his talent and pushed him to shine. But the past lingered. Ethan hadn't spoken to Margaret since that night, hadn't returned to Silver Pines. He didn't know if he ever would, until Caleb reappeared. One spring afternoon, Ethan was sketching in a park when a familiar voice called his name. Caleb, now taller, with the same shy smile, stood before him. "I thought I'd never see you again," Caleb said, his eyes bright with emotion. They talked for hours, rekindling what had been stolen. Caleb had left Silver Pines too, escaping his own family's judgment. Together, they began to heal, their love a quiet defiance against the world that had tried to break them. But Ethan couldn't shake the shadow of Margaret. She was still in Silver Pines, living as if nothing had happened. Caleb urged him to confront her, not for her sake, but for his own closure. Ethan resisted, afraid of reopening old wounds. Yet, as his love for Caleb grew, so did his need to face the past. He wasn't the scared boy in the mountains anymore. He was stronger, braver, and ready to reclaim his story. 2 years later, Ethan stood at the edge of Silver Pines, his heart a tangled knot of resolve and dread. The town hadn't changed, the same diner with its flickering neon sign, the same church steeple piercing the sky, the same whispers of judgment cloaked in small-town charm. Caleb squeezed his hand, grounding him. "You don't have to do this alone," Caleb said, his voice steady. Ethan nodded, but his mind was a storm. He'd spent years rebuilding himself, piecing together a life of art shows, late-night talks with Caleb, and dreams of a future where they could marry without fear. Yet, Margaret's shadow loomed large. He'd learned she was still in town, living in the same house where he'd grown up, now married to a local mechanic named Roy. Social services had never pursued her. Her lie about Ethan running away had held. The injustice burned, but Ethan wasn't here for revenge. He wanted answers, maybe even peace. The house looked smaller than he remembered, its paint peeling, the porch sagging. Ethan knocked, his pulse racing. When Margaret opened the door, her face froze. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes carrying a weariness Ethan didn't recognize. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling. "I want to talk," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. Caleb stood behind him, a quiet pillar of strength. Margaret's gaze flicked to Caleb, her lips tightening, but she stepped aside, letting them in. The living room smelled of stale coffee and regret. Roy was at work, she said, and Ethan was glad. This was between them. "Why?" Ethan asked, the question he'd carried for years spilling out. "Why did you leave me there?" Margaret's hands fidgeted, her eyes avoiding his. She muttered something about shame, about the town's gossip, about her fear of losing face. "You were my son," she said finally. "But you chose a path I couldn't accept." Ethan's chest tightened. "I didn't choose to be gay, Margaret. I chose to be honest." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "You left me to die? Do you even care?" Her silence was louder than any answer. Caleb's hand on his shoulder kept him grounded, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Margaret's story unraveled over the next hour. She'd been raised in a world of rigid rules, where love like Ethan's was a sin, a stain. When she'd found his letters to Caleb, panic had consumed her. She thought abandoning him would fix things, would save her reputation. "I didn't think you'd survive," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The confession hit Ethan like a punch, but it also freed something in him. Her cruelty wasn't his fault. As they left, Caleb pulled Ethan close. "You did it," he whispered. Ethan nodded, but the weight of Margaret's words lingered. He'd hoped for an apology, for some sign of remorse, but her regret seemed more for herself than for him. Still, facing her had loosened a knot in his soul. He felt lighter, like he could breathe deeper. Back in Boulder, Ethan threw himself into his art, his paintings now vibrant with color and defiance. His latest piece, a canvas of a lone figure in a snowy mountain, won a local gallery showcase. Caleb, now a barista with dreams of opening his own cafe, cheered the loudest at the opening. Their life together was simple but rich: shared breakfasts, late-night movies, plans for a future in a city where they could be themselves. But Silver Pines wasn't done with Ethan. A letter arrived, forwarded from his old foster care address. It was from Roy, Margaret's husband. He'd overheard their conversation and wanted to meet. Ethan hesitated, wary of more pain, but Caleb encouraged him. "Maybe he knows something you need to hear," Caleb said. Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed. They met Roy at a diner on the outskirts of town. He was a burly man with kind eyes, nothing like Ethan had expected. Roy apologized for Margaret's actions, explaining he hadn't known the full story until recently. "She's not well," he said. "Not physically, but up here." He tapped his temple. "She's haunted by what she did." Roy handed Ethan a box of his old things: sketchbooks, photos, a watch from his dad, that Margaret had kept hidden. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a piece of his past returned. Ethan's heart wavered. He didn't owe Margaret forgiveness, but Roy's sincerity stirred something in him. He began to wonder if closure meant understanding, not just confronting. As he and Caleb drove back to Boulder, the box in the back seat, Ethan felt a shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Ethan's life in Boulder bloomed like the wildflowers he once sketched. At 24, he was a rising artist, his work featured in galleries across Colorado. Caleb's cafe, Sunlit Brew, was a cozy haven where Ethan's paintings hung on the walls, each one a testament to their shared resilience. But the past was a stubborn ghost, creeping into Ethan's dreams: snowy mountains, Margaret's cold eyes, the ache of abandonment. One evening, as Ethan and Caleb closed the cafe, a news alert pinged on Caleb's phone. A wildfire was tearing through Silver Pines, threatening the town. Ethan's first thought was Roy's kindness, the box of memories he'd returned. Then came Margaret. Was she safe? Did he care? The conflict tore at him, but Caleb, ever steady, suggested they check on the town. "Not for her," Caleb said, "but for you." The drive to Silver Pines was tense, the horizon glowing orange with distant flames. The town was in chaos: evacuation orders, volunteers hauling supplies, ash falling like snow. Ethan spotted Roy at the community center, coordinating relief efforts. "She's at the house," Roy said when Ethan asked about Margaret. "Won't leave." His voice was heavy with worry. Against Caleb's protests, Ethan drove to the old house. The air was thick with smoke, the sky a bruised red. Margaret was on the porch, clutching a photo album, her face gaunt. "Go away, Ethan," she said, but her voice lacked its old venom. He ignored her, stepping inside to grab essentials: clothes, documents, anything to keep her safe. She resisted, but he was stronger now, physically and emotionally. As they drove to the evacuation center, Margaret was silent, the album clutched to her chest. Ethan glanced at her, seeing not the monster who'd abandoned him, but a broken woman, trapped by her own fears. At the center, Roy took her hand, gratitude in his eyes. Ethan felt no warmth for her, but helping her felt like reclaiming power over his past. The fire spared Silver Pines, but the town was shaken. Ethan and Caleb stayed to help, serving coffee from Sunlit Brew's mobile van, a gift to the weary firefighters. The townsfolk, once quick to judge, now thanked Ethan, some with hesitant smiles. He didn't need their approval, but their acceptance was a quiet victory. Back in Boulder, Ethan's art took a new turn. His paintings now blended the stark whites of snowy mountains with the warm golds of sunlit fields, symbolizing his journey from survival to thriving. Caleb proposed one night, under a sky full of stars, and Ethan said yes, tears mingling with laughter. They planned a small wedding, inviting their chosen family, foster siblings, Ms. Rivera, even Roy. But Margaret's presence lingered. Roy called, saying she was sick. Cancer, fast-moving. She'd asked for Ethan. He didn't want to go, but Caleb, always his anchor, reminded him, "This isn't about her deserving you. It's about you being free." Ethan agreed, not for her, but to close the final chapter of his pain. The hospital in Silver Pines was sterile and quiet, the beeping monitors a stark contrast to the chaos of Ethan's memories. Margaret lay in the bed, frail and hollow-cheeked, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or resignation. Caleb waited outside, giving Ethan space, but his presence was a steady pulse in Ethan's heart. "I didn't think you'd come," Margaret whispered, her voice raspy. Ethan sat, unsure what to say. He didn't know her comfort, yet he felt no anger, only a strange pity. "I'm here," he said simply. She reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he asked, "Why now?" Margaret's story came in fragments. The cancer had forced her to face her life, her choices. She spoke of her own childhood, raised by a father who saw weakness as sin, love as a transaction. "I was afraid," she said, "of you, of what people would think. I was wrong." The words weren't an apology, not fully, but they were the closest she'd ever come. Ethan listened, his heart a battlefield of grief and release. He told her about his life, his art, Caleb, the family he'd built. "I survived because I chose to," he said. "Not because of you, but despite you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but Ethan felt no satisfaction. He felt free. He left the hospital with Caleb, the weight of years lifting. They drove back to Boulder, planning their wedding with renewed joy. Ethan's art flourished, his latest series a tribute to resilience, each piece a story of overcoming. The wedding was small but perfect, held in a meadow under the Rockies, with wildflowers everywhere. Roy attended, his presence a quiet bridge to the past. Margaret died a month later. Roy sent Ethan her photo album, filled with pictures of him as a child, his dad, moments Margaret had cherished despite her cruelty. Ethan kept it, not for her, but as a reminder of the boy who'd survived. He and Caleb framed one photo, a young Ethan, smiling with his dad, and hung it in their home, a symbol of love that endured. Years later, Ethan and Caleb stood on a hill overlooking Silver Pines, the town now a distant memory rather than a wound. Their life was full. Sunlit Brew had grown into a local chain. Ethan's art was celebrated nationwide, and they'd adopted a daughter, Lily, whose laughter filled their home. The mountains, once a place of despair, were now a backdrop to their joy. Ethan had returned to Silver Pines one last time, not for Margaret, but for the community. He and Caleb hosted an art workshop for local teens, many of whom faced their own struggles with identity. Ethan shared his story, not to shame the town, but to show what was possible: love, resilience, a life reclaimed. The teens listened, some with tears, others with hope, and Ethan felt his past transform into purpose. As they hiked down the hill, Lily between them, Ethan thought of Margaret. He didn't forgive her, not fully, but he understood her brokenness. His survival, his love with Caleb, his daughter's smile. They were his victory, not her defeat. The mountains stretched before them, no longer a threat, but a testament to his strength. Ethan's final painting, unveiled at a Denver gallery, was his masterpiece, a boy in the snow, rising toward a golden horizon, his hand reaching for another's. Titled Chosen, it was a love letter to Caleb, to Lily, to himself. The crowd wept, and Ethan, holding Caleb's hand, knew he'd turned pain into beauty. The meaning of his journey wasn't in erasing the past, but in building a future where love won. Ethan Carter, once abandoned, had returned, not for revenge, but to show the world that even in the coldest mountains, the human heart could thrive.